You think you know who I am, but you don't, Sophie Lang said softly as she set the tray down with a practiced grace that belied her calm composure. Ethan Blackwood froze mid-step, his polished leather shoes clicking against the marble lobby floor, his eyes narrowing as he studied the woman before him. He had entered the luxury hotel expecting a cursory greeting, a nod from a receptionist, maybe a perfunctory smile, yet here stood a waitress, or so he assumed, whose quiet confidence seemed to demand acknowledgement. "You're sweet, Mr. Blackwood," she continued, her voice steady, even, yet carrying an authority that made him pause. He swallowed, adjusting the cuff of his tailored navy suit, the platinum watch catching the soft light above, reflecting his meticulous attention to detail, his accustomed control over every situation. "You," he started, surprise flickering across his sharp features, but Sophie simply smiled, enigmatic and calm, and gestured toward the elevator. As they rode upward in silence, the hum of the lift punctuated by soft jazz from the lobby below, Ethan's mind raced, attempting to reconcile the poised composure of the woman in front of him with his preconceptions of who she was supposed to be. Her movements were deliberate, precise, each gesture a testament to an inner discipline that commanded attention without demanding it, and he found himself involuntarily studying the way she held herself, the quiet confidence that seemed entirely at odds with the simple black uniform she wore. "I've managed your check-in personally," she said, glancing at him without breaking stride, her eyes meeting his with a calm scrutiny that made him shift slightly. "And?" he asked, the single word sounding harsher than intended, the edge of curiosity now mingling with disbelief. Sophie's gaze didn't waver. "And everything will be perfect," she replied, soft but unmistakably firm. A small smile touched her lips, not of arrogance but of self-assured clarity, and Ethan felt an unfamiliar tension, a subtle unease that prickled at his normally impenetrable confidence. When the elevator doors opened to the 10th floor, Sophie led him through a corridor lined with contemporary artwork, her steps silent, measured, each motion echoing a competence that demanded he take note. Yet he remained silent, mouth slightly open, caught between incredulity and the magnetic pull of recognition he couldn't quite define. They reached the door to the suite, and she held it open, allowing him to step inside, the city lights spilling across the polished hardwood floor, illuminating the sleek furniture and carefully curated decor. Ethan's eyes flicked to the plaque on the wall, Sophie Lang, owner, and for a moment he didn't breathe, shock rooting him in place. The woman he had dismissed, the one he assumed to be subordinate, was the architect of this very space, the orchestrator of its elegance and order. Sophie set down the keycard with the same calm precision she had displayed all along, turned toward the panoramic windows, and Ethan found himself studying her every movement, suddenly aware that the assumptions he had carried in like armor were entirely misplaced. Her hair was pulled back neatly, eyes sharp and alert, a small enigmatic curve of a smile on her lips, and she moved through the room as if she owned not just the space but the narrative, the unspoken rhythm of control and poise. Ethan's jaw tightened, a slow exhale escaping as he processed the realization that his perception had been incomplete, perhaps even arrogant, the assumptions he had held now crumbling under the quiet power of Sophie's presence. "You've underestimated me." Her words finally broke the silence, soft but deliberate, each syllable weighted with calm authority. Ethan swallowed hard, nodding slowly, his mind a whirlwind of reflection and curiosity, caught between admiration and the unaccustomed discomfort of being humbled without a word raised in confrontation. The city lights shimmered across the room, reflecting both the elegance of the suite and the subtle, commanding presence of Sophie Lang, leaving Ethan standing quietly, absorbing the first lesson in humility he hadn't known he needed, the quiet power of someone who had raised the standard without ever raising her voice. And as he watched her turn toward the window, poised and unshaken, he realized that this was only the beginning of a story he hadn't anticipated, one where status, wealth, and arrogance would be measured against the quiet, unyielding strength of a woman who had already rewritten the rules without saying a word. The city stretched out beneath the towering windows, the lights flickering like distant stars, and Sophie Lang moved through the suite with the same quiet precision she had shown from the moment Ethan had entered, her steps measured, deliberate, commanding, without demand. Ethan remained rooted near the center of the room, his hands resting lightly on the back of a chair, gaze following her movements as if trying to decode every subtle gesture. "You have an incredible sense for organization," he said finally, his voice low, carrying a mixture of disbelief and admiration. Sophie paused, glancing at him over her shoulder with a slight, enigmatic smile. "It comes from years of learning to anticipate every detail before it becomes an issue," she replied, her tone calm, unhurried, leaving him absorbing each word like a careful puzzle piece falling into place. She retrieved a folder from a sleek side table, sliding it across to the nearest counter with a practiced hand. "These are the schedules and guest arrangements for the next 2 weeks," she said, her eyes briefly meeting his, steady and unwavering. Ethan leaned forward slightly, scanning the neatly typed lists, the highlighted sections, the annotations in a precise hand, and a flicker of surprise crossed his face. "You handle all of this yourself?" he asked, trying to mask the awe in his tone. Sophie nodded, a soft affirmation without a hint of pride, her posture relaxed yet undeniably authoritative. "I have a capable team, but I prefer to oversee the details personally," she said, and Ethan noted the subtle confidence in her voice, the unspoken command that did not require assertion to be acknowledged. He moved closer to the window, peering out at the city below, then back at her, curiosity now fully mixed with respect. "I underestimated you," he admitted quietly, the words unusual for him, carrying a weight of sincerity he rarely allowed himself to express. Sophie returned to the counter, adjusting a small display of brochures with smooth, practiced movements, then turned to him with a calm, assessing gaze. "Many people make assumptions," she said, voice even, eyes reflecting the faint city lights. "It is their error, not mine." Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line, a slow exhale escaping as he absorbed the quiet authority in her words, realizing the depth of control and poise she maintained without ever raising her voice or demanding attention. He observed the subtle way she handled each task, the ease with which she navigated between decisions and actions, the confidence that radiated in her calm efficiency, and he felt a shift within himself, an acknowledgement of her power that had nothing to do with wealth or status. The air between them was charged not with tension, but with unspoken understanding, a recognition that the game of assumptions had been quietly overturned. Sophie moved toward the large windows, placing a hand lightly on the ledge, her posture elegant, poised, surveying the city with a quiet authority that filled the room more than any spoken command could. Ethan followed her gaze, and in the reflection of the glass he saw not just her image, but the undeniable presence of someone who had mastered the subtle art of leadership through grace, intellect, and presence. He realized that this encounter was only the beginning, that the assumptions he carried about status, control, and recognition were being gently dismantled by her quiet, unwavering strength. "I have guests arriving for the gala tomorrow," Sophie said, turning her attention back to the carefully arranged documents on the counter, her movements deliberate, each action precise, measured, and yet fluid, as if every step were both thought and statement. Ethan's eyes remained on her, absorbing every gesture, every measured word, every controlled motion, his usual impatience replaced by a keen attentiveness, the sudden humility of someone witnessing an entirely different standard of command. The city outside continued to shimmer, the night air heavy with possibility, and Ethan understood, without needing any further explanation, that Sophie Lang had established an unspoken rule. Her worth and her power were never to be assumed, and anyone who tried would discover it through observation, reflection, and quiet reckoning. He shifted slightly, finally taking a step forward, the weight of recognition settling in, a subtle acknowledgement that the story unfolding was far more intricate than he had anticipated, and that the quiet strength of this woman, her calm authority and impeccable judgment, had rewritten the rules of engagement for anyone who thought status or wealth could define influence. Sophie Lang moved toward a side table, arranging a set of keys and notes with exacting precision, her back to him, and Ethan realized that the game of assumptions, of power, and of recognition had been irrevocably changed, leaving him not only humbled but keenly aware that watching, learning, and respecting her would be the only way to understand the world she commanded without uttering a word. The suite was silent except for the subtle hum of the air conditioning, and Sophie Lang moved effortlessly between the desk and the seating area, her attention split between the upcoming gala schedules and the small details that no one else seemed to notice. Ethan Blackwood remained near the panoramic windows, his reflection merged with the city lights, and he could not look away from her composed, deliberate movements. Each gesture was precise, every action measured, yet nothing felt forced or artificial. It was natural authority, quiet but unmistakable. "I have coordinated the arrival of every guest for tomorrow," Sophie said, her voice calm, eyes briefly meeting his before returning to the documents spread across the counter. Ethan stepped closer, studying the meticulous notes, the color-coded highlights, and the neatly pinned annotations, realizing that every aspect of the hotel's operation, every potential issue, had been anticipated and accounted for. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, a hint of awe in his tone, not as a compliment, but as an acknowledgement of skill he had not expected. Sophie did not pause or look up, continuing to adjust the schedules, shift notes, and verify reservations, her calm energy filling the room with a sense of control and order. Ethan watched silently, the usual impatience and expectation he carried in boardrooms now tempered by the recognition that he was observing someone in command not through overt authority, but through presence, intelligence, and care. He realized that every step, every calculated movement she made, reflected not just experience, but foresight and a deep understanding of human behavior. The city lights glimmered beyond the windows, reflecting off the polished surfaces of the suite, and for the first time, Ethan felt the weight of humility pressing quietly into his chest. Sophie turned slightly to retrieve a key from a small tray, placing it on the counter with deliberate precision. "I have also prepared contingency plans for any last-minute changes," she said, her words steady, carrying a soft, unwavering confidence. Ethan nodded slowly, a quiet respect forming as he processed the scope of her capability, understanding that the woman he had presumed to be subordinate had orchestrated an entire network of responsibility with ease and poise. He felt an unfamiliar tension, a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and the subtle discomfort of realizing that his assumptions had been entirely wrong. "You anticipate everything," he said finally, voice low, almost reflective, as if speaking aloud allowed him to internalize the lesson he was beginning to learn. Sophie's hands paused for a moment, adjusting the papers, then continued, each motion fluid, purposeful, and quietly commanding. "It is not a matter of anticipation alone," she said, glancing at him briefly, her expression calm, measured, but of understanding how each choice affects the next. "Preparation is nothing without perspective." Ethan's chest tightened slightly as he absorbed her words, the statement simple yet resonant, encapsulating a philosophy of leadership he had rarely encountered. The soft light from the city illuminated her profile, the calm determination in her eyes, and the subtle strength in her posture. He took another step closer, not to challenge, but to witness, to understand, and to learn from the quiet authority she radiated. "I see now," he said, voice almost inaudible, "that I have misjudged you entirely." Sophie continued her work, the faint smile on her lips suggesting acknowledgement without self-congratulation, her focus unwavering. Ethan studied the precise movements, the way she balanced multiple tasks, the effortless way she maintained control over every detail while remaining approachable, and he realized that her influence was derived not from status or wealth, but from presence, intellect, and a calm, measured confidence that quietly demanded respect. The night outside deepened, city lights twinkling like a tapestry beneath them, and Ethan understood that this was more than a lesson in humility. It was a revelation about the nature of true authority and the power of understated competence. Sophie retrieved a final set of keys and notes, arranging them carefully, then paused, her gaze lifting to meet his fully for the first time, eyes steady, unwavering. Ethan held her gaze, silent, the realization settling fully that every assumption he had held, every preconception about power, influence, and worth had been quietly dismantled by her calm, deliberate presence, leaving him not only surprised but compelled to reconsider everything he thought he knew about leadership, skill, and the measure of true capability. The room remained hushed, filled with unspoken acknowledgement, the city stretching endlessly beyond the windows, and Ethan knew that this encounter was only the beginning of a story in which quiet strength, patience, and wisdom would shape the course of every interaction to come. A subtle yet profound transformation that would ripple beyond this suite and linger in thought long after the lights dimmed. The early morning light filtered softly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting elongated shadows across the polished hardwood and highlighting the subtle elegance of the suite as Sophie Lang moved with quiet efficiency, adjusting the placement of a few brochures and reviewing her notes with a steady hand. Ethan Blackwood remained near the window, arms crossed, watching her with an intensity that was uncharacteristic for him, his expression a mix of curiosity and cautious admiration. "Your attention to detail is remarkable," he finally said, his voice low, careful, betraying a sense of humility he rarely showed. Sophie did not look up immediately, continuing to flip through the organized schedules with an almost meditative focus before glancing at him briefly, her eyes calm and discerning. "It has to be," she said simply, her tone even. "Every decision here affects someone else. Oversight is not just preference, it is responsibility." Ethan took a step forward, noticing the subtle confidence in her posture, the measured grace in her movements, and the quiet authority that required no declaration to command recognition. He found himself observing the way she anticipated every action, adjusted for potential disruptions, and maintained composure as if the flow of the entire hotel depended on her presence alone, which, in fact, it did. Sophie set down the folders, her movements fluid, eyes briefly meeting his as if acknowledging his silent observation. "We have a gala tomorrow, and I have confirmed every detail with the event coordinators. The menus, seating arrangements, and welcome packages are all finalized. I also prepared a contingency plan for any last-minute changes," she said, her words calm, but carrying a weight of command that made Ethan realize the depth of her influence and foresight. He nodded slowly, the realization settling in that this was not just a demonstration of competence, but a reflection of her strategic understanding of people, priorities, and timing. Sophie moved toward the counter, arranging a set of keys and documents with meticulous precision, then paused to glance at Ethan, her gaze steady, unflinching. "I expect excellence from myself and those I lead," she said softly, a quiet statement that resonated more profoundly than any grand declaration could have. Ethan felt a subtle shift within himself, a recognition of the standard she set not through words but through consistent, deliberate action. He stepped closer, studying her work, noting the confidence in her gestures, the clarity of thought evident in every adjustment, every review. "It is impressive," he admitted, the words almost forced, carrying the weight of sincerity and the understanding that she had surpassed every expectation he had unconsciously imposed. Sophie smiled faintly, a small, controlled expression of acknowledgement, then returned to the documents, her calm authority filling the room in a way that left Ethan simultaneously humbled and intrigued. The city beyond the windows gleamed in the soft morning light, yet it was the quiet command of Sophie Lang within these walls that captured his attention entirely. Each movement she made was deliberate, every action purposeful, and Ethan realized that the balance of power had quietly shifted without any overt confrontation, leaving him to consider, silently, the magnitude of her presence and the standards she upheld. As she finalized the last set of notes and stepped back to survey her work, Ethan recognized that he was witnessing a masterclass in subtle influence, leadership, and control, the kind that did not require authority to be acknowledged, and he felt an unfamiliar respect settle over him, a recognition that true power and capability were not defined by wealth alone, but by the ability to command attention, respect, and outcomes through presence, intellect, and quiet decisiveness. Sophie turned once more to the panoramic view of the city, her posture calm, confident, and unshakable, leaving Ethan to absorb the lesson in humility, strategy, and understated leadership, knowing that every future interaction would be measured against the standard she had silently set in this morning light. And as he stood observing, He understood that the quiet strength of this woman had reshaped his perception of authority, competence, and the meaning of influence. The morning sun had fully illuminated the city skyline, casting a golden hue across the suite where Sophie Lang moved with the same calm, deliberate precision she had maintained since Ethan Blackwood had first entered. She reviewed the final arrangements for the gala, cross-referencing guest lists, catering notes, and event timings, her fingers tracing lines of text with a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate authority without force. Ethan watched from the large windows, arms crossed, noting the meticulous care in every adjustment she made, the smooth efficiency that left no detail unattended. I have ensured every aspect is accounted for, from the valet arrangements to the floral decorations, she said, her voice steady, measured, conveying competence without the need for emphasis. Ethan took a step closer, the soft click of his shoes on the polished floor echoing faintly, his eyes following her every motion. He felt an unusual stillness settle over him, a recognition that the woman he had assumed to be merely a receptionist or a subordinate held a presence that commanded attention in a way he had never experienced. Sophie paused briefly to arrange a set of invitations on the counter, sliding them into precise stacks, then looked up at him, her gaze calm but piercing, as if silently measuring his reaction. "Attention to detail is not optional in my line of work," she said softly, yet the statement carried weight far beyond the words themselves. Ethan nodded slowly, the depth of her competence settling in his mind, challenging assumptions he had held about status, authority, and the visible markers of power. Each gesture she made was precise, fluid, and confident, her hands moving with an unspoken assurance that left him observing rather than acting, learning rather than instructing. He realized that every small action, every methodical adjustment, reflected a combination of intelligence, experience, and an innate understanding of leadership that transcended any conventional display of authority. The suite was filled with the quiet hum of accomplishment, a testament to her ability to orchestrate complex tasks seamlessly. Sophie moved toward the window, standing tall, the city stretching out beneath her like a map of possibilities, and Ethan felt the weight of realization pressing lightly, yet persistently against his chest. The balance of influence had shifted in ways that had been subtle, deliberate, and entirely undeniable. He followed her gaze, seeing the streets and rooftops bathed in the soft morning light, and recognized that the lesson extended beyond the walls of the suite into every interaction he would have with people who wielded true, understated authority. Sophie adjusted a few documents on the counter, her movements smooth, controlled, each adjustment a silent assertion of her presence and skill, and Ethan felt himself drawn into the rhythm of her competence, the way her calm decisiveness dictated the flow of the room, without a single raised voice or overt command. "Every choice has a ripple effect," she said, glancing at him briefly, the words simple yet resonant, capturing the essence of her influence and the clarity of her thought process. Ethan considered her statement, the room, and the city beyond, and understood that his own perspective on power, control, and respect had been quietly but irrevocably expanded. The morning sunlight reflected off the polished surfaces, catching the edges of the folders, keys, and meticulously arranged documents, and each glint seemed to highlight the precision and care Sophie applied to every element of her responsibility. Ethan remained silent, absorbing the scene, noting the fluidity of her actions, the calm authority in her posture, and the deliberate care in her decisions. He felt a subtle shift within himself, a quiet acknowledgement that this encounter had not been merely about observation but about recognition, humility, and the understanding of leadership as exercised through presence, intellect, and measured action rather than wealth or title. Sophie paused once more, taking a final look at the organized space, then turned to survey Ethan with a calm, confident gaze, her expression poised, steady, and unshakable. Ethan met her eyes, fully aware that the standards she set, the quiet strength she embodied, and the precision with which she conducted herself had permanently altered his perception of competence, authority, and the influence of understated power, leaving him not only impressed, but deeply compelled to reflect on the subtle, yet profound impact of her presence. the lesson extending far beyond this suite into every future interaction he would have with people who truly understood the art of quiet. Effective leadership. The sunlight had shifted slightly, casting warm reflections across the suite as Sophie Lang moved from the counter to the seating area, her steps purposeful and measured, each movement reflecting the quiet authority she carried effortlessly. Ethan Blackwood remained near the window, leaning lightly against the frame, his gaze following her every action, absorbing the subtle cues of confidence and meticulous attention she displayed. "You have anticipated every detail," he said finally, his tone low, deliberate, carrying a mix of respect and disbelief. Sophie glanced at him briefly, her expression calm, composed, a small, knowing smile resting on her lips. "It is necessary," she replied evenly, her eyes scanning the documents before her as she adjusted a few notes and schedules. "Preparation without foresight is incomplete." Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in as he observed the fluidity of her movements, the way she balanced multiple tasks seamlessly while maintaining a presence that was quietly commanding. He could not help but notice the precision in every adjustment, the care in every action, the subtle assurance that communicated authority without a single raised voice. Sophie turned to the seating area, arranging a few chairs to ensure optimal flow for the gala guests, her hands moving gracefully, deliberate, every motion efficient yet unconsciously elegant, leaving Ethan silently noting the distinction between superficial leadership and the kind of influence that came from competence, presence, and unwavering control. "Every decision has consequences," she said softly, glancing at him with a calm, measured gaze. "Understanding the ripple effect of each action ensures that everything functions harmoniously." Ethan exhaled slowly, realizing that her perspective extended beyond the immediate tasks to encompass the broader implications of her choices, a lesson he rarely encountered in the high-powered business world he inhabited. He stepped closer, studying her posture, the subtle command in the way she moved, the quiet confidence that did not demand attention but nonetheless drew it naturally. "It is remarkable," he admitted, voice nearly a whisper, yet weighted with sincerity. Sophie returned to her documents, her focus unwavering, the faint curve of a smile suggesting acknowledgement without the need for validation. Ethan observed the deliberate method in which she reviewed every item, the ease with which she navigated between details, and the quiet decisiveness that defined her presence. The city outside shimmered, the morning light catching the surfaces of the suite, highlighting the elegance and order that Sophie maintained effortlessly, each element in place as a reflection of her attentive care and strategic thinking. Ethan felt a subtle, unaccustomed humility settling in as he recognized that true influence and command were not demonstrated through authority alone, but through consistency, foresight, and the quiet mastery of responsibility. Sophie moved toward the windows, her stance calm, eyes sweeping across the city with a quiet command, and Ethan felt the realization deepen that the subtle power she wielded was derived not from wealth or title but from presence, competence, and the deliberate execution of every task with care and purpose. He took a slow step forward, absorbing the atmosphere of disciplined control and measured authority, understanding that he was witnessing the embodiment of leadership exercised through grace, intellect, and unspoken expectation. Sophie paused briefly, taking in the view herself, then turned to the carefully arranged documents, double-checking schedules and guest lists, her movements precise, deliberate, a testament to the thought and effort embedded in every decision. Ethan remained silent, impressed, reflective, the quiet impact of her presence shaping his understanding of influence, responsibility, and the measure of true capability. The sunlight continued to illuminate the suite, emphasizing the subtle interplay of shadows and light across the room, and Ethan realized that this was more than an observation. It was a lesson in quiet authority, in measured action, and in the understated power of a person who commanded respect without assertion. Sophie adjusted a few final notes, her gaze calm, steady, and unwavering, and Ethan understood that her standard had been set without words, without demand, leaving a clear, indelible mark on his perception of competence, influence, and the silent, formidable presence. of someone who had mastered the art of leadership through presence, precision, and quiet decisiveness. And he knew that every interaction from this point forward would be measured against the standard she had set so effortlessly in the soft glow of the morning light. The afternoon sun had warmed the suite, the light reflecting off the polished surfaces and casting a soft glow across the carefully curated space, and Sophie Lang moved with the same calm, deliberate efficiency that had defined every moment since Ethan Blackwood had arrived. Her hands adjusted the final placements of documents and keys, ensuring that each item was aligned perfectly, yet her movements never appeared rigid or hurried. There was a fluidity, an elegance to the precision that spoke of confidence and control. Ethan stood near the windows, observing her silently, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass, the hum of life below contrasting with the quiet command that filled the room. "It is remarkable how seamlessly everything operates under your guidance," he said finally, his voice low, measured, and carrying the weight of genuine admiration. Sophie glanced at him briefly, her eyes calm, clear, and assessing, as if weighing his words for meaning before returning her attention to the documents. "Order and foresight are inseparable," she said, her tone even, her presence unshakable. "Every detail has consequences, and anticipating them allows for smooth execution." Ethan took a step closer, his usual certainty replaced by curiosity and the subtle tension of realizing he had been wrong to assume simplicity where there was sophistication, quiet authority where he expected only compliance. He noted the way she handled each folder, the ease with which she navigated between schedules and notes, her movements confident but unassuming, commanding respect without demanding it. The room seemed to breathe with her presence, the faint sounds of pages shifting, keys clicking, and the distant hum of the city blending into a rhythm of quiet mastery. "I have guests arriving tonight for the gala," she said, looking up from her work just long enough to meet his gaze. "Every detail has been verified, and contingency plans are in place for unforeseen changes. It is not enough to react. One must anticipate and prepare." Ethan nodded slowly, the sincerity of her words resonating with him. A lesson unfolding in real time, the kind of understanding that transcended titles, wealth, and authority, teaching the subtle power of observation, preparation, and understated competence. Sophie returned to her documents, her fingers tracing lines with careful precision, her expression calm, and Ethan found himself unconsciously mimicking her patience, absorbing the meticulous care in her actions, and realizing that the true lesson was in her quiet composure, the effortless command that did not rely on proclamation or assertiveness, but on consistency, awareness, and intellect. The city outside glimmered in the late afternoon light, but within the suite, the focus remained on the subtle orchestration of order and foresight that Sophie maintained, each movement reinforcing the standard she had set from the beginning, a silent measure of competence and authority that left Ethan both impressed and reflective. "I see now," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, "that influence does not always require prominence or noise. It is earned through presence and mastery." Sophie allowed the observation to pass without comment, her attention unwavering, a faint smile suggesting acknowledgement rather than pride. Ethan studied her carefully, noting the ease with which she balanced multiple responsibilities, the quiet decisiveness in each action, and the way she conveyed authority through controlled movements, measured gestures, and an unspoken understanding of every element she oversaw. He felt a deep respect forming, a realization that his previous assumptions had been entirely misplaced, that the measure of true capability extended far beyond wealth, title, or visible power, and that in this room, the quiet, precise, and deliberate actions of one person could command the attention, admiration, and reflection of another without a single word raised in confrontation. Sophie paused, taking a final look at the neatly arranged papers and keys, then turned toward the panoramic view, her posture calm, poised, and deliberate, leaving Ethan to consider the depth of her influence, the subtle authority that guided every action and decision, and the quiet lesson in leadership, foresight, and competence that she had imparted simply by being present, fully in control, and unwavering in her command, leaving him to absorb the implications long after the last paper had been adjusted and the light of day continued to illuminate the space. The golden hour light spilled across the suite, turning the polished surfaces into a tapestry of warmth and shadow as Sophie Lang moved with her usual calm, deliberate precision, reviewing the guest lists and final arrangements for the evening gala. Ethan Blackwood stood silently near the windows, hands clasped loosely behind his back, observing her movements with a mixture of awe and cautious humility. He had spent years accustomed to command, accustomed to making decisions that affected hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, yet here he was, witnessing a quiet authority that did not require overt display, but commanded attention through presence and competence alone. "Every last detail has been considered," Sophie said softly, placing a set of folders in perfect alignment on the desk, her voice calm, measured, yet carrying an implicit weight that made Ethan lean forward slightly, absorbing each word. She moved toward the seating area, adjusting chairs, reviewing notes, and checking schedules, her motions fluid, deliberate, a dance of precision that conveyed control without needing to assert it verbally. Ethan could not help but notice the subtle way she anticipated issues before they arose, the thoughtful foresight in each adjustment, and the quiet confidence in her posture and expression. "You see the ripple before it happens," he said, more to himself than to her, his tone betraying both respect and the rare acknowledgement that he had been wrong to assume simplicity where there was sophistication. Sophie glanced at him briefly, eyes steady, calm, piercing even, before returning her attention to the meticulously organized documents. "Preparation without foresight is incomplete," she said simply, and Ethan realized that every detail she managed, every calculation and consideration, was executed with a clarity and precision that few could match. The city outside stretched endlessly, buildings glinting in the fading sunlight, yet all he could focus on was the quiet mastery within the suite. Sophie moved toward a small counter, arranging a series of notes and keys, her movements measured, deliberate, each action imbued with subtle authority that reinforced her presence without demand. Ethan observed her carefully, noting the ease with which she transitioned from task to task, the calm decisiveness in her actions, and the way she maintained control without raising her voice or drawing unnecessary attention. "It is remarkable," he admitted, his words soft, reflective, carrying the weight of genuine admiration and recognition that he had underestimated the depth of her competence. Sophie allowed a faint, knowing smile to touch her lips, but did not pause her work, her calm composure a testament to her mastery of both the practical and the strategic. Ethan stepped closer, his attention drawn to the deliberate care in every action, the quiet authority that seemed effortless, the competence that emanated from her every movement. The soft ambient light accentuated the polished surfaces of the suite, highlighting the meticulous organization and order that Sophie maintained as naturally as breathing, and Ethan felt a subtle shift within himself, an acknowledgement that the measure of true influence extended far beyond titles, wealth, or visible power. Sophie retrieved a few additional documents, setting them neatly into place, her gaze occasionally lifting to meet his, steady and unflinching, as if silently affirming the unspoken lesson of competence, foresight, and quiet authority she had imparted from the moment he entered. Ethan felt a newfound respect, a reflective humility, and an awareness that he was witnessing a standard of leadership that had been quietly established without ostentation or proclamation. Each gesture, each movement, each calculated adjustment spoke volumes, teaching him that presence, intelligence, and controlled decisiveness could wield influence more profoundly than any outward display of power. The room seemed to pulse with this quiet mastery, every item, every arrangement a reflection of Sophie's careful thought and unyielding standard. Ethan remained at the window, absorbing the lesson, realizing that every interaction he had from this point forward would be measured against the benchmark she had silently set. Sophie paused finally, surveying her work one last time, hands resting lightly on the counter, posture calm, eyes confident, leaving Ethan standing still, fully aware that he had observed not just organization and preparation, but the essence of understated power, the kind that commands respect, inspires reflection, and reshapes the understanding of what true leadership and influence entail. all accomplished without a single word raised in confrontation, leaving him quietly transformed and deeply compelled to reassess every assumption he had carried into the room. The late afternoon sun filtered through the expansive windows, bathing the suite in a warm, golden light that shifted across the polished floors and the carefully arranged furniture, and Sophie Lang moved with her usual quiet precision, checking each set of documents and verifying the final adjustments for the evening gala. Ethan Blackwood remained near the window, arms crossed loosely, observing her movements with a mixture of fascination and reflective humility, noticing how every gesture, every measured step carried an unspoken authority that demanded recognition without assertion. "You have thought of everything," he said softly, his voice low, careful, almost in awe. Sophie glanced at him briefly, eyes steady and clear, then returned her focus to the documents with deliberate care. "Preparation is only valuable when it anticipates need," she replied, calm and measured, her presence filling the room without a word of command. Ethan stepped closer, studying the way she adjusted the seating arrangements, reviewed the schedules, and moved from counter to table, each action fluid and purposeful, reflecting an understanding that went far beyond simple organization. He noticed the subtle way she anticipated each detail, the efficiency in her movements, and the confidence she maintained without the slightest hint of arrogance or showmanship. "It is extraordinary," he said quietly, his tone reflective, acknowledging the depth of her competence. Sophie paused for a moment, placing a final set of keys and papers neatly on the counter, then turned to survey the room and the city beyond the windows, her posture calm, composed, and assured. Ethan felt the weight of realization settle over him. The woman he had assumed to be a subordinate had quietly demonstrated mastery over every aspect of her domain, commanding respect through presence, intelligence, and careful execution rather than authority or wealth. Sophie picked up a folder and reviewed it one last time, her movements deliberate, precise, each action reinforcing the standard of excellence she maintained without speaking louder than necessary, her quiet composure a stark contrast to the bustling city outside. Ethan watched intently, noting the subtle confidence in her gestures, the thoughtfulness in her decisions, and the quiet power that emanated from every measured motion. "You do not simply manage, you guide," he said finally, voice low, reflective, as he absorbed the full scope of her ability to balance responsibility, foresight, and human consideration simultaneously. Sophie allowed a faint, acknowledging smile, her eyes briefly meeting his before returning to the task at hand, unshaken, unhurried, embodying a calm decisiveness that silently demanded respect and attention. The suite felt alive with the rhythm of her methodical precision, each movement, each adjustment reinforcing the quiet authority she held, and Ethan realized that he was witnessing a standard of leadership that had been quietly set and maintained without proclamation, a lesson in influence that did not rely on dominance, but on competence, insight, and unwavering presence. He moved closer, studying the subtle nuances in her demeanor, the fluidity of her actions, the seamless way she balanced multiple considerations at once, and he felt a deepening respect, a reflection of humility, and the recognition that he had underestimated the power of quiet mastery. Sophie adjusted a few remaining items on the counter, her movements smooth, controlled, and efficient, then paused, surveying the space and the city beyond, her eyes calm, unflinching, and commanding in their quiet assurance. Ethan understood that the encounter had shifted something in him, a new perspective on authority, competence, and influence, leaving him reflective and attentive to the subtle, profound lessons being imparted through her presence and measured actions. Each gesture, each adjustment, each deliberate decision communicated far more than any spoken instruction could, and he realized that this quiet, understated power was the measure of true capability. Sophie took a final glance at her organized notes, documents, and keys, her posture unwavering, her presence serene yet commanding, leaving Ethan silently acknowledging that her calm, deliberate mastery had reshaped his perception of leadership, influence, and the nature of respect, creating a standard that would guide his understanding of competence and authority in every interaction to come. And as the city lights began to glimmer faintly beyond the windows, he remained standing, quietly, transformed by the subtle yet undeniable impact of her poised and meticulous command. The evening descended gently over the city, the glow of streetlights reflecting in the polished glass of the suite, and Sophie Lang moved with a composed, deliberate rhythm, adjusting final seating charts and verifying last-minute details with the same quiet mastery that had defined every moment since Ethan Blackwood arrived. Ethan remained near the windows, his hands resting lightly on the marble ledge, eyes following her movements with an intensity that was rare for him, the habitual confidence he carried in boardrooms tempered by awe and reflection. "It is astonishing how every element is accounted for," he said softly, voice low, careful, as if speaking too loudly might disrupt the balance of precision she maintained. Sophie glanced at him briefly, her gaze calm, measured, then returned to her work, a small, knowing curve of her lips suggesting acknowledgement without pride. "Anticipation is as important as execution," she said simply, the statement quiet but imbued with authority, a principle reflected in every motion she made as she reviewed documents, adjusted chairs, and verified schedules. Ethan stepped closer, noting the subtle assurance in her posture, the quiet decisiveness in her gestures, and the way she commanded attention without demanding it. Every adjustment, every glance, every minor correction was executed with precision, creating an aura of control that filled the room more profoundly than words could. He could see how she balanced multiple tasks simultaneously, each movement deliberate, efficient, and smooth, yet entirely natural, as if she had rehearsed this harmony for years. "The level of control you maintain is extraordinary," he admitted, voice reflective, allowing himself a rare moment of humility. Sophie continued her meticulous work, placing folders, notes, and keys neatly, pausing briefly to scan the suite and the city beyond the windows, her calm, steady gaze carrying the unspoken message that her authority was derived not from wealth or title, but from skill, foresight, and presence. Ethan exhaled slowly, internalizing the lesson, recognizing that competence and influence were measured not by status or visibility, but by the ability to command respect and orchestrate outcomes through quiet, precise action. Sophie walked back to the counter, reviewing the final arrangements for the gala, her movements graceful and intentional, every decision reflecting anticipation, insight, and responsibility. Ethan remained still, watching, absorbing the depth of understanding that allowed her to navigate the complex logistics of the evening with ease and elegance. "It is not simply organization," she said, looking up briefly, her eyes calm and unwavering, "but understanding how each action impacts the whole. Leadership is silent when done correctly." Ethan nodded, the weight of her words settling in, the humility of recognition deepening as he observed her flawless execution and understated authority. The soft glow of city lights illuminated the suite, casting reflections on the polished surfaces, highlighting the order and clarity Sophie maintained, each element a reflection of her foresight and careful control. Ethan felt a quiet shift within himself, an acknowledgement that his assumptions had been misplaced, that real influence did not require dominance or ostentation, but stemmed from consistent competence, measured action, and the unspoken power of presence. Sophie paused, surveying her work, hands resting lightly on the counter, posture calm, composed, and confident, leaving Ethan to reflect on the subtle yet profound demonstration of leadership he had witnessed. Each motion, each adjustment, each careful decision communicated more than words ever could, teaching him that quiet authority and skillful execution carried a force that could surpass any outward display of power. The city continued to glimmer beyond the windows, yet the suite was alive with the rhythm of her competence, a silent lesson in influence, foresight, and unwavering command that Ethan could not ignore. As Sophie took a final glance at the meticulously arranged documents and preparations, her gaze lifting to meet Ethan's steady, composed, and unflinching, he understood that the impact of her quiet mastery would resonate long after the evening, reshaping his perception of authority, competence, and the true measure of power. The evening light softened into a gentle amber as Sophie Lang moved through the suite with deliberate calm, reviewing the guest lists one final time and adjusting the arrangements with meticulous care, her eyes scanning every detail for any potential oversight. Ethan Blackwood stood quietly near the windows, the city sprawling beneath him, and he watched her with a new awareness, noticing the subtle authority in her posture, the quiet decisiveness in each gesture, and the way she seemed to command the room without a single word raised. "You have an extraordinary ability to see every angle," he said finally, voice low and reflective, his usual air of certainty replaced by respect and curiosity. Sophie glanced at him briefly, eyes calm and measuring, then returned her attention to the neatly arranged documents. "Anticipation is the foundation of control," she said softly, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of experience and insight. Ethan shifted slightly, stepping closer, studying her movements as she adjusted seating charts and cross-referenced schedules with smooth precision, noting the confidence in her rhythm, the careful consideration of each minor detail, and the ease with which she balanced multiple priorities without visible stress. The city lights glimmered faintly outside, but the focus remained on the room, the quiet, controlled energy that Sophie exuded, and Ethan found himself drawn into the cadence of her competence, the subtle mastery that had been established from the moment he entered. "It is not just preparation," he continued, almost to himself, "but understanding the impact of each choice." Sophie paused, her hands resting briefly on a set of folders before adjusting a few items on the counter, then turned to meet his gaze, calm and unflinching. "Every action creates a ripple," she replied evenly, "and true leadership is knowing how those ripples interact." Ethan exhaled slowly, absorbing the lesson, the quiet authority and measured intellect she displayed, shifting his perspective on influence, control, and respect. He watched as she walked back to the counter, her hands moving gracefully, arranging the documents and keys with precise, fluid movements, each adjustment reinforcing the order and clarity she maintained effortlessly. He could see the depth of her foresight, the seamless integration of planning and execution, and the confidence she maintained without the need for assertion or proclamation. "I underestimated what can be achieved with quiet confidence," he admitted, voice thoughtful, acknowledging the subtle power she wielded through action rather than words. Sophie smiled faintly, a small, knowing acknowledgement, her focus returning immediately to the work at hand, undistracted by his observation. The suite felt alive with her presence, each action, each precise movement reinforcing the standard she set, teaching a lesson in competence, foresight, and influence that resonated far beyond the visible tasks she managed. Ethan remained near the windows, quietly reflecting, noting the calm authority she exuded and the way her presence dictated the flow of the room with effortless mastery. The soft glow from the city outside illuminated the meticulous arrangements and polished surfaces, highlighting the balance and order Sophie had achieved. He realized that her influence was quiet, deliberate, and commanding without the need for demonstration, a form of power that could not be challenged by assumption or presumption. Sophie returned once more to review the final notes, her gaze sweeping across the suite, the city beyond, and the carefully curated documents, her posture composed, precise, and calm. Ethan observed silently, the respect deepening as he understood that every detail, every decision, every subtle adjustment reflected an understanding of responsibility, foresight, and presence that few could match. He took a slow step forward, absorbing the rhythm of her movements, the quiet authority of her gaze, and the measured clarity of her decisions, realizing that he had been witness to a masterclass in understated power, one that had permanently reshaped his perception of competence, leadership, and the profound influence of presence and intelligence. Sophie paused, resting her hands lightly on the counter, eyes steady and unwavering, and Ethan knew that he had seen a standard established that would guide his understanding of true leadership, the quiet strength of meticulous preparation, and the unspoken authority of a person who commanded respect through action, presence, and unwavering composure, leaving him reflective, impressed, and quietly humbled. The evening had deepened into a soft, tranquil dusk, the city lights beginning to shimmer like countless tiny lanterns across the horizon, and Sophie Lang moved through the suite with the same composed precision that had defined every moment of the day. Her hands adjusted the final placements of documents and keys, verifying details with meticulous care, while her eyes scanned the schedules, notes, and seating charts as if anticipating issues before they could arise. Ethan Blackwood stood near the large windows, watching silently, the hum of the city below a distant undertone to the quiet authority that Sophie exuded. It is remarkable how seamlessly everything operates under your guidance, he said finally, voice low, measured, almost in reverence for the calm mastery he observed. Sophie glanced at him briefly, her expression serene, eyes sharp and evaluating, then returned to her meticulous work with an effortless grace. Order and foresight are inseparable, she said softly, her voice calm, measured, yet carrying an unspoken weight of command. Ethan stepped closer, taking in the subtle rhythm of her movements, the quiet decisiveness in each gesture, the way she anticipated needs before they were spoken or revealed. Every adjustment, every placement of documents or notes, conveyed control, presence, and understanding, and he realized that this was a demonstration of influence far more profound than any title or wealth could communicate. The way you anticipate every detail, he continued, almost to himself, changes everything. Sophie adjusted a few more items on the counter, her motions fluid and precise, and looked at him briefly, eyes calm and steady. Preparation without awareness is incomplete, she said softly, her words deliberate, carrying insight that resonated beyond the immediate tasks. Ethan observed the way she balanced multiple responsibilities effortlessly, moving with measured precision from one task to another, maintaining a rhythm that was both graceful and commanding. He felt an unfamiliar tension, a mix of admiration and reflection, recognizing that he was witnessing not just organization, but the embodiment of calm, deliberate authority, and the power that came from presence and foresight rather than assertion or dominance. Sophie moved toward the seating area, adjusting chairs and reviewing notes for the gala, each motion controlled, efficient, and purposeful, reflecting a deep understanding of logistics, human behavior, and the subtle interactions that could influence the outcome of the evening. Ethan's eyes followed her every move, noting how she maintained control without raising her voice, commanding attention through action rather than declaration. You lead without ever asserting dominance, he said finally, voice quiet, reflective, acknowledging the rare combination of competence, calm, and authority. She demonstrated. Sophie paused to place the final set of documents neatly on the counter, her eyes lifting to the city beyond the windows, a calm, steady gaze that conveyed both awareness and assurance. Ethan realized that her influence extended beyond the immediate environment, a subtle, guiding force that shaped the space and the flow of events without overt direction. The soft glow of the city outside illuminated the suite, highlighting the meticulous organization and order that Sophie maintained effortlessly, each item a testament to foresight, competence, and quiet authority. Ethan felt a deepening respect, recognizing the lessons in leadership, precision, and understated power that were being imparted through her actions. Every gesture, every careful decision, every deliberate movement communicated a standard of excellence that spoke louder than words ever could. Sophie adjusted a few final notes, then stepped back, surveying the suite and the city beyond, posture calm, composed, and assured. Ethan observed silently, absorbing the full impact of her quiet mastery, the way she commanded respect through intelligence, presence, and deliberate action. He understood that this encounter had shifted his perception of competence, authority, and influence, leaving him reflective and quietly humbled. Each movement, each arrangement, each precise adjustment demonstrated leadership in its most effective, understated form, teaching Ethan a profound lesson about the power of calm, deliberate control, and the far-reaching influence of presence, foresight, and impeccable execution. Sophie's gaze lingered on the city for a moment, steady and unwavering, before returning to the suite, ensuring every element was in its place, leaving Ethan with the realization that her quiet mastery had permanently reshaped his understanding of authority, competence, and the nature of true influence, and that every future encounter with leadership would now be measured against the standard she had set so effortlessly and so profoundly in the still glow of the evening light. The suite was quiet, bathed in the warm glow of evening, and Sophie Lang moved through the space with the same serene precision that had defined her presence from the start, adjusting the final notes, ensuring every detail was perfectly aligned, and surveying the city skyline through the expansive windows as if taking stock of all she had accomplished. Ethan Blackwood remained near the center of the room, silent, arms relaxed at his sides, his eyes tracing her movements with a mixture of admiration and reflection, realizing that the lessons of the day were far deeper than any he had anticipated. "I understand now," he said quietly, his voice low but steady, "that true strength is measured by grace and competence